So our next speaker is Carl Jones. Carl Jones is kind of a personal hero. Because there are very few people who can say that, they've been directly responsible of saving at least one species from extinction. That's something that really must feel quite good. His experience and his team's experience, the way they worked in the Masquerines, probably Mauritian Wildlife Foundation, is probably the organization that has saved the highest number of species from extinction by hectare. It's easier on an island than on a continent, but I think what they've done is quite impressive because there are other islands that didn't achieve that, so we're going to learn from his experience. And then Luis Ortiz, who is from Mexico, but who lives in New Zealand. Once we started talking, he signed as a participant. I wanted to invite him to add some comments because there's a very strong cross-pollination between New Zealand and the Masquerines. And this is, I think, one of the main ideas and issues of this meeting, the concept of cross-pollination and different cultures influencing another. It wasn't obvious, but the black-footed ferret had a huge impact on the Iberian lynx through the role of Astrid. And the exchange of information between these two islands is very important, and you will see tomorrow the huge influence of Africa in Argentina and India, for example. So, Carl, please, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ignacio.
Thank you.
It's a great pleasure to be here. I don't often come to conferences like this, but when I do, I always feel enriched. We hear so much bad news about the problems facing the planet, the loss of species diversity, climate change, and yet we have lots of answers. I've been involved in conservation biology for over 4 decades, and I've seen huge changes. And I'm an optimist. I'm one of those people who believes we can solve the problems of this earth. And I believe that most species are savable. And I think unless we actually are optimistic, we don't go ahead and try and achieve great goals. Of course, the world isn't going to turn out exactly as we'd like it to, but there are always solutions. And today I'm going to talk about some of my work on Mauritius, and it's entitled From Species to Systems. The work there has been greatly influenced by Gerald Durrell. Gerald Durrell was a naturalist, an author, and a zookeeper, and he formed the Jersey Zoo. And Jerry believed passionately that captive breeding had a huge part to play in the conservation of critically endangered species. And he set up his zoo in Jersey to work with some of the world's most endangered species. But he believed that zoos the primary role should be conservation, not entertainment, but conservation, research, education, and of course, you go to enjoy the animals as well. And he believed we should be trying to develop techniques for saving critically endangered species. And our Jersey Zoo has become a training school where we train people in conservation management. But we also work in some of the countries where we have critically endangered species. So we work with the species in captivity and in the wild. And I'm going to talk to you about my work in one of our most important projects, or I think it's one of our most important projects on Mauritius. Jerry was always fascinated by the dodo. And he kept saying, what a shame we've lost the dodo. If we'd had captive breeding when the dodo was around, they could still be here today. Anyway, the one thing we need to do is to look to the past to rebuild or to build the future. Other people have mentioned this in this meeting. And it really is important that we look back in time to try and understand the ecological histories of the species and the systems we work with. And I'm not talking about looking back a generation or two, but we should be looking back centuries, at least to the last major climate change, which was 10,000 years ago, and to think about what the world was like then. We heard in the talk about rewilding Europe, about how we're trying to rebuild some of the systems that existed centuries ago. Regrettably, we don't know a great deal about some of these systems, but this doesn't mean that we can't try and build facsimiles of those. The island of Mauritius is a wonderful island to work on if you're interested in ecological histories, because although it's regarded as a paradise island, people go there on honeymoon, it's actually ecologically devastated. It's an island that's had many extinctions, an island that's changed a great deal. This illustration is the first ever illustration of Mauritius, published in 1602, and it's of the first settlement on the island. And it shows the early settlers essentially exploiting the island, catching fish, chopping down trees, killing turtles, and so on. But it's a very important historic document. The first ever illustration of a dodo. There's an echo parakeet, and there's also a pink pigeon there somewhere. So anyway, I look at that and I think, wow, wouldn't it have been amazing to have been on Mauritius 500 years ago and to have seen pink pigeons and echo parakeets and dodos and giant tortoises all around the beach. Anyway, we can all dream. And this is an artist's impression of what the island looked like. A vibrant island pulsing with life. Okay, things have changed, but the world has changed. The black shows the amount of forest cover, and in 1800 you can see that most of the island was still covered with primary forest. But by 2000, only 2% of the island had full canopy native forest left. That's devastating. But Mauritius is fairly typical of many oceanic islands. So it's little surprise that we've lost lots of species from these islands. Also, we have the problem of introduced species. And these are 4 of the worst ones that we have on Mauritius. And we heard earlier on about cats, which are a big problem on many islands worldwide, as well as on New Zealand and Australia. And for anybody working on tropical islands, the only good cat is a dead cat. Anyway, that remark has got me into a lot of trouble in the past. We do humane cat control. That's another issue. Okay, as a consequence of habitat destruction, introduced species, there have been many extinctions on Mauritius. We all know about the dodo, but there have been many others. And these are reconstructions of some of the extinct forms. And I'll go around that list clockwise. This is the red rail, the browsing tortoise, blue pigeon, lesser fruit bat, raven parrot, and giant skink. We may lament their loss. We lament the extinction of species. But also think about the loss of ecological function. A predatory rail, a browsing tortoise, a seed-dispersing pigeon, a pollinating fruit bat, a seed disperser, and an omnivore. And we're talking about rebuilding systems when many elements are missing. And I'll get back to this later. Thankfully, we still have some amazing species left on Mauritius. Many of them are critically endangered. but they are taxonomically very important species. And I'll talk to you about some of the species that I've been involved with. So I'm going to talk about our approaches to species conservation. And some of our approaches have actually been quite experimental, and I'm quite proud of some of the results that we've achieved, trying new techniques. Reintroduction biology isn't just about following the IUCN guidelines. It's about being creative. It's about thinking about new techniques and new ways forward. The guidelines are very good, but they are just that, guidelines. In my career, the guidelines have been used repeatedly as a stick to beat me. Carl, you shouldn't have done that. It's not in the guidelines, people used to tell me. So always bear that in mind. Okay, this is the Mauritius Kestrel. This is the species I went to Mauritius to work with. In 1974, there were only 4 wild birds known. There may have been 1 or 2 more, but they certainly weren't many more. And in fact, the genetic signature suggests that it actually did go down to 1 breeding pair. And when I went to Mauritius, I went there in 1979, and there were still only 2 pairs breeding in the wild, plus a few non-breeding birds. And my instruction was, Carl, you're going to Mauritius, we want to pull out elegantly, hand over to the locals. Which actually meant closing down the project because the locals didn't have the expertise or the resources to work on species like the Mauritius Kestrel. The people who told me that now deny they ever said it. But this was actually written by Norman Myers in 1979, and it was actually embracing an idea which was very common at the time, that with critically endangered species, we shouldn't even bother to try and save them because they're unsavable. We might abandon the Mauritius Kestrel to its all but inevitable fate and utilize the funds to proffer stronger support for any of the hundreds of threatened bird species that are more likely to survive. If you embrace that type of philosophy, when you go to very degraded islands like Mauritius, you're basically giving up on everything. So that's not a philosophy that I think we should embrace. Unfortunately, some of my colleagues and some of the funders that supported my work didn't believe in that either. And I was very fortunate that when I went to Mauritius, I had people who could advise and help me, good mentors. And I think we all need good mentors to guide us and to advise us. And I worked very closely with the Peregrine Fund in North America, and especially with Tom Cade, who's a very dear friend. And I said, well, what we should do with the Mauritius Kestrel is to take the eggs from the last breeding pairs, bring them into captivity, hatch them in an incubator, rear the young, and use them to establish a captive population. I wrote my proposal, sent it off. I had very mixed responses. But Tom Cade said, go for it. And the Peregrine Fund supported my work, and they supported my work for a decade. A lot of other organizations sat on the fence, and some were dead against the idea. They thought it was the end of the kestrel if we brought it into captivity. Anyway, we harvested the eggs, brought them into captivity, put them in an incubator, and 30 days later they hatched. And we had some beautiful babies. And as a young lad, I was a terrible student. I never used to go to school. I used to play truant. And I used to breed birds in my back garden. That was my hobby. And I was able to breed European kestrels. And as a teenager, when I heard about the plight of the Mauritius Kestrel, I said to myself, I could save that. So I went to Mauritius, and with the arrogance of adolescence, or in my early 20s, I was convinced I could do it. And we hatched the kestrels, and I had the incubator in the office. I had a bed on the floor, and I lived with the eggs and the young, and we hatched them and reared them. And we were able to establish a successful captive breeding project. It took many years, of course, but we got them to breed well in captivity. And when we had surplus young, we started releasing them into nature. But what we did was we released them using falconry techniques, the technique of hacking, which many of you here will be familiar with. It's used for birds of prey worldwide. But I also trained all the birds. I trained them to come to a whistle, so I could walk into the forest and whistle, and they'd fly down, and we'd feed them. And we did this for a number of years, and we were able to release several hundred birds. And these are a mixture of birds we'd bred in captivity, but when the birds started breeding in the wild, we'd harvest those eggs as well to double clutch them. And all the birds were trained. So at one stage, I had over 100 trained kestrels in the wild, and I could wander into the Black River gorges and whistle, and kestrels would fly down. And it made monitoring very easy. Okay, so this is showing one of our students feeding young kestrels, and you can see they're naturally very tame. And in 10 years, we released over 300 birds, and we established them in the two main mountain ranges. We also released some in the north, but those only lasted for a few years, unfortunately. But this population, which had become extirpated, is now thriving. We have about 50 breeding pairs every year, and we have about 25 breeding pairs in the southwest. The population has in recent years declined slightly, and I'll get back onto that again. It was really interesting hearing Astrid talking about the decline in the black-footed ferret. We've seen similar declines in Mauritius Kestrel, so this is something we should think about. I think with many endangered species, the job is never finished. And I think that was mentioned earlier about the situation in Australia as well. Anyway, with the kestrel, we did captive breeding, clutch and brood manipulations, reintroduced 331 birds, and today we have a wild population of between 200 and 300 birds. We're working on them very hard, and we're going to try and get the population up a bit more. But actually, the holding capacity of the island may be such that we can't get it much higher. Anyway, the Mauritius Kestrel was a wonderful boost for morale. And it gave us the confidence to start working on some of the other birds. We then moved on to the pink pigeon. And the pink pigeon had been showing a long-term population decline. This graph is essentially a guess, but I put together all the information to try and understand what had happened to the pigeon historically. The long-term declining numbers was a result of cyclones. It was also due to habitat destruction. And by 1990, we only had 9 or 10 birds. We actually had 10 birds in the wild, but one of those we think might have been a captive bird that we'd released a few years before. But we only had 9 or 10 birds in the wild, and all those were ringed. And we wanted to try and boost that population, and we were lucky we had some captive birds. I know there are some captive breeding people here, and there are a lot of zoo people. And I'm a great believer in zoos. But when it comes to working with critically endangered species, you actually need specialist breeding centers. Because one of the problems we have with all the species I work with is that very often they're very choosy about who they breed with. And with the pink pigeon, you put a genetically important male with a genetically important female, and they don't like each other. And you only have to look at this picture here, and you've got a male pigeon cooing to the female, "Caw, caw," and the female couldn't care less. Don't I just know that feeling? Anyway, so when it comes to managing captive populations, it requires pragmatism as well as science. You need to use a bit of common sense. And very often you can't get the genetically most important birds to breed with the other important birds. So anyway, it's very much a compromise. The pink pigeon story is quite a success. We've done lots of reintroductions. We've now established 9 subpopulations. And the next few years, we want to release some more birds into another subpopulation. However, they need long-term management, supplemental feeding, predator control, killing those cats, and also disease management. Disease has been a major issue in limiting the population of pink pigeons. And this is something that happens when you have intensive management. The animals are coming to close contact, and you very often get very fluid disease transmission. So we work a great deal with vets, and disease issues have been prominent with several of our species. However, we now have over 500 free-living birds, which is better than extinction. And I'm hoping in the next few years we'll get over 600. We also have sequenced the genome of the pink pigeon, and we're working with a number of universities, and they're even able to identify alleles that represent fitness and susceptibility to disease and so on. So we're going to go into another era of intensive genetic management. I have told the scientists that you won't get pink pigeons to breed with the birds you want them to breed with, but anyway, we'll see what happens. So we're working towards that. And of course, the work on the pigeons encouraged us to move forward with the echo parakeet. This is the last endemic parakeet in the Western Indian Ocean Islands outside of Madagascar. There was once a radiation of parakeets on La Réunion, Rodrigues, Seychelles, and Mauritius. It's only the echo parakeet that's now left. So it's quite an important species. And when we started working with it, we knew nothing about its biology. Absolutely nothing. And in fact, the odd notes that had been written on papers proved to be wrong, so we had negative knowledge. And so the early work revolved around field work, numbers, distribution, and basic ecology, wandering around in the forest with a pair of binoculars, writing down field notes. And also ecological histories, finding out what we could about the history of the species and the history of Mauritius. And when they nested, intensive nest studies. And we tried to provide artificial nest boxes because we felt that nest sites might be limiting. And we also tried some supplemental feeding. And what's really interesting, if you look at some of the things we've done here, this is basic natural history. It's not hardcore science. Yes, we do need science when we're looking after endangered species, but we also need common sense and some natural history knowledge. Very often you get academics wanting to study some arcane aspect of ecology or life history, whereas in reality you just need basic information. And this is so lacking for most of the species we work with. We also found that pink pigeons also suffer from a whole range of diseases, including viral diseases. And this is something that we were looking at very, very early on in our work when we were working with vets. And whenever we actually handled birds, we'd take blood and various samples. And it soon became clear that the echo parakeet was heading for extinction. And by the late 1980s, we only had about 8 to 12 known birds. There might have been a few more, but not many. And in some years, there was no detected breeding whatsoever in the population. And most of the 12 birds we knew of were males. They were skewed very much to males, and they were quite old birds. And so what we did was that we worked intensively on those last few birds in the wild. We teamed up with New Zealanders. We love New Zealanders. New Zealanders are some of the best field workers in the world. They don't have any social skills whatsoever, but that's another point. And they're actually great. You put them in the field, you let them get on with it. They're great at killing cats, climbing trees, doing all that sort of stuff, and just doing the work. So we worked very closely, and we soon found out very poor breeding success. Young were dying in the nest from food shortages, and they were being parasitized by tropical nest flies. So what did we do? We decided that every single nest we would check. And of course, at the beginning, we only had 1 or 2 nests. We'd climb to the nests every day, monitor weight and development. Any chicks that were losing weight, we'd harvest for captive breeding. And we actually were very ruthless about this. We'd bring them down to our captive breeding center, which was very basic. We just had basically a room, but it was adequate. We had proper incubators and brooders. And we hired a vet to help us with the rearing of our baby parrots. And it was a parrot pediatrician. And she came from Laurel Park and worked with us for many years. And it was amazing because she could save the weakest, most sickly chick. She'd come up with a chick that was almost dead, and she'd give it oxygen, give it fluids, do other things that would warm it up, and it would recover. Arantxa was amazing, but she loved her parrots so much, she even taught them to talk. So when we actually did our first releases, the parrots would fly down, land on our shoulder, and say, "Hola, hola." Anyway, that's not a criticism, because we like our birds to be tame when we release them. Anyway, I'm digressing here. We were able to take rescued birds and captive bred birds for reintroduction, and we experimented a great deal on reintroduction techniques. Most people, when they release parrots, breed parrots, put them in a cage, keep them for a few months, then let them go. And what we did, we wanted to think about the social development of young parrots. So we had parent-raised and hand-raised birds that we raised in social groups. So we'd hand-rear young parrots in groups that replicates the normal family unit. So you're getting the right sort of social interaction. And when we released the birds, we released them in cohorts that replicated the social group for the species, which in this case is a family unit. And a family unit, biparental care plus 2 or 3 young, so you'd have about 5 birds, which is what you've got there. So that is a typical release group. We experimented on the age of releasing birds, and we released 139 birds over a period of 6 years. And they were a mixture from harvested eggs and young, but also captive bred birds. They were a mix of hand-reared and parent-raised. But we decided we'd try and release them as young as possible. And we experimented from about 2 months up to about 4 months of age. The ones at 4 months of age, yeah, they did okay, but they weren't as relaxed in the wild as those that were released very young. So we developed techniques of releasing our birds as young as possible. They normally fledge at 57 days. Most of our birds were about 50, 60 days when we released them. A lot of people would say, well, these were naive young birds. You're letting them go in the wild. They get up to all sorts of trouble. But we argued that when you think about the social development of animals, they actually have to learn social skills. They have to learn coordination, flying, predator avoidance, a whole range of survival and social skills, which they won't learn in a cage. If you think of the wild and you think of a captive environment, the captive environment is actually a deprivation chamber compared to what they have in nature. So we felt it was important that our birds grew up in the wild. And the result was we had nearly 90% first-year survival, which I think is telling us a great deal. And in fact, for all our releases, we've always tried to release our birds as young as possible. Of course, there are problems if you've got lots of predators around. But on Mauritius, we didn't have many predators, so we were able to get away with this, and it works very, very well. We also support our birds post-fledging or post-release, and we support our birds permanently. A lot of them become independent of our care, but some remain dependent upon food. But what they do is they go out and they forage naturally, and then they come back and they top up if they haven't been able to find enough food. And we have birds that do not take supplemental food, and we have those that do, and look at the difference. We've done a lot of work on this, and supplemental feeding increases survival, increases productivity of breeding birds, and the birds do really quite well. So we are saying that we really should be embracing the idea of managing our animals post-release. It's not a matter of just getting them out there and weaning them quickly. When you do that, you're condemning them to very high mortality rates. We have found that with all the species that we've worked with, that if there's enough food, they become independent. And I've now worked with 14 different species of birds, and that's been the case with all of them. Okay. So, 8 to 12 birds in 1987, intensive management of the wild population. We have over 750 birds today, and it's still going up. But, as with the pink pigeon, the need for long-term nest site management and some supplemental feeding. When we're working with highly endangered species, we have to embrace the notion of long-term management if we want to keep those species. And I think that's been coming through in many of the talks today. We need to move away from some of the traditional approaches to reintroduction biology. Okay, what have we done? If you look at what we did with our species, basically what we were doing was understanding and managing limiting factors and applying long-term minimum management. This is very controversial, but I'm a great believer in long-term management. We're very happy to maintain species in captivity long-term and to manage them intensively in cages. But when it comes to in the wild, people are a bit reticent about long-term care. But it's needed for many species, especially in places like Mauritius, where the forests are denuded, where they're very degraded, where there are lots of challenges. So if we want to keep them, we've got to look after them, and at least until we've corrected some of those major factors. And what we are doing is we are taking captive breeding techniques and applying them to wild and free-living populations. This is the role for captive populations, is to learn techniques that we can apply to free-living populations. And of course, animals that are living at liberty are still fulfilling ecological roles, and they're under some natural selection. Animals in captivity rapidly become domesticated. So it's far better to have your animals free living, even if they're being managed, than in captivity. There's a lot of work now showing that we start seeing the signs of domestication in many species in as few as 10 generations. And many of the effects of domestication are largely irreversible. So instead of breeding species in captivity long term, we should be thinking about keeping them and managing them in the wild. Okay, what we're doing is based upon science. It's based upon the work of David Lack, who in 1954 published The Natural Regulation of Animal Numbers, who showed that populations of vertebrates are controlled by a small number of variables: food, predators, competitors, disease, and in some cases breeding sites. And what we do is we look at the problems. If there's food shortages, we feed them. If there are predators, we control them. If there's disease, we try and manage the disease. And we provide nest sites if there are shortages of natural nest cavities. So that's what we do. And the result has been, this is showing what's happened to the three species I've just talked about. The kestrel, the pigeon, and the parrot. Okay, I told you the kestrel has declined in recent years, mainly because we managed them so intensively at the beginning, the population went up above holding capacity. Now then, in the year 2000, I showed this graph to my bosses in Durrell. I hasten to add, neither of those bosses are there now. But at the time, I showed them the graph, and I said, look what we've done in Mauritius. Isn't this wonderful? And they looked at the graph, and they looked at me, and they looked very stern and started to shake their heads. And they said, Carl, why did it take you so long? I said, what? They said, look, the work started in the 70s. It's taken decades to save 3 species. I was furious. And I really didn't say anything because they were my bosses. Geraldo knows who they were. But anyway, I then went home and I thought, actually, they've got a point. It did take us a long time. So I went through the literature. I looked at other projects. Hawaiian goose, whooping crane, Californian condor, Hawaiian crow, and lots of others. And they all show this same pattern. A long period where you're not going anywhere as you're learning the techniques and finding out the birds, finding out about the biology and the problems. Very often there's a decline that carries on, and then you finally work out the techniques and the population takes off. And it's roughly that period, at the very quickest, is 10 times age of first breeding. And for many, it's much, much longer. It's the same for all the New Zealand birds, Seychelles birds, and so on. I haven't found an exception as yet. So it does take a long while to actually recover animal populations. This doesn't only just apply with birds. So I think there's a very important lesson there. We all apply for grants for 3 years and 5 years, and we get very good at sort of bending the truth. At the end of 5 years, we'll have achieved this, 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 and this. And it's all impossible. It takes such a long while to recover species. So we should bear in mind that if we want to recover species, we should be thinking in terms of decades. And the organization I work for, Durrell, for all our programs, we're now developing 100-year plans or a 100-year vision, looking into the future, because there are no quick fixes, or very few quick fixes. Okay, the power of the individual. This is something I believe passionately in. You look at all the successful projects, look at all the projects you're involved with. It's individuals that are driving those programs. Individuals that are making the difference. And I want to talk about one of my staff who works on the island of Rodrigues, which is a small island off Mauritius. His name is Richard Payendi. And in the 1980s, I went to Rodrigues and we set up a project there to work on the very rare plants and the very rare birds. And we wanted to do some habitat restoration and propagation of the critically endangered plants. And so we started telling our team there what to do. And Richard Payendi turned to me and he says, we're not having some white foreigner coming here telling us what to do with our wildlife. I said, what? He says, this is our wildlife. We can look after it. Yeah, you can advise us, but we're in charge over here. So I said, okay. And Richard was amazing in that he could get volunteers and he could really capture people's enthusiasm. And soon he had teams of young Rodriguans helping him grow plants in his nurseries and planting them out. He was a very difficult young man to manage, but we got on reasonably well. Anyway, he soon started growing tens of thousands of rare endemic plants per year and planting them out into government areas. And soon we started to see a forest growing, and the Rodrigues Fodey and warbler, which were critically endangered, started to increase. And the result has been two of the most spectacular recoveries for any bird species ever. The Rodrigues Fodey went down to 12 individuals in 1967. The Rodrigues warbler for a number of years was thought extinct. In 2020, we had over 20,000 Rodrigues warblers and 12,500 Rodrigues Fodeys. And the the Rodrigues fruit bat, which had declined down to tens of individuals, we also have 20,000 of those. Because the Rodrigans helped to rebuild their forest. And I think that's a wonderful story, because it tells us about the power of individual people. Anyway, Richard Payendi left us, and he went to work in politics. We got into terrible trouble because the Mauritian Wildlife Foundation was accused of backing various political parties and so on. However, he ended up getting elected, he ended up as minister, and Rodrigues was one of the first islands where they banned the use of single-use plastics. And he's changed the whole philosophy where they now plant native trees instead of exotic trees. So anyway, that's a nice story. And I think it shows that there's room for great hope. And we did all this on relatively small amounts of money. Okay, if you look at our birds, this is the Living Planet Index, which is produced by the Zoological Society of London. And this is tropical island birds. This is an index. And that's our birds. So it shows we're bucking the trend. So we're obviously doing something right. Okay, let's move on. Stages to species recovery. We all talk about process. We all talk about protocols. But if you actually look at projects over time, you see that there are some very distinctive stages they go through. I'll go through these very quickly. I recognize 5 stages. Know your species, understand limiting factors, corrective management, monitoring and evaluation, and using species to drive whole habitat and ecosystem recovery. I'll go through these quickly. Know your species. These are the points I discussed earlier on. Basic biology. If it's not already known, get out there and start collecting information on the natural history of the species you work with. Get an insight. Learn to think like the animal. Become empathetic. Become an empathetic naturalist and an objective scientist. Okay, understand rarity. When a species is declining, just think about it. It's either not surviving well or it's not reproducing well. So you just have to understand those variables. And as we mentioned, David Lack told us, what those factors were. Just a very small number of factors we've got to consider. And then we start doing corrective management. That's not a masquerine bird at all, that's a Hawaiian crow. I've done that because of Hannah sitting there. And Hannah's going to save this species. It now only exists in captivity. It's extinct in the wild. And Hannah's going to go back to Hawaii and establish them, breeding in nature. Okay, I just mentioned that. So corrective management, we all know what it is. Basically, you're looking at the limiting factors, and you're doing something about it. Predator control, supplemental feeding, disease, and so on. Okay, monitoring and evaluation. In all my talks, I always include pictures of myself, because I'm vain. And I also hanker after those days when I was younger and fitter, and I could do the field work. And I'm up a ladder there, and I've got a spoon on the end of a stick, and I'm trying to ladle out a Mauritius Kestrel egg out of a nest cavity. Mauritius Kestrels nest deep in cliff cavities to avoid cyclones. And the only way I could get the eggs was just a bamboo pole with a spoon on the end. Anyway, that shows me as a young man. Please note, lovely legs. Okay. Monitoring and evaluation. We all talk about science. The science you need is basic science. You need science that informs conservation, survival and productivity, distribution and numbers, and evaluating the techniques you've been using. These are the foundations on which you base your science, your scientific program. And from species to systems. Something I've noticed, you start working with species, you end up restoring the system in which it is found. We've seen that in all the cases discussed today. Setting up protected areas in Australia, rewilding parts of Europe. In New Zealand, restoring islands to put some of the endangered species on. And this is really powerful. And you never hear conservationists talk about it. They always talk about, do we put resources into species, or do we put resources into systems? And when I was in university, they used to argue, which is the best? Conservation of species or systems? And everybody said, well, it's got to be systems, hasn't it? But actually, working with species is a very powerful driver for restoring systems. And we've talked today about improving ecosystem function, removing invasive species, and about ecological replacements. And think about Mauritius. What can we possibly do on an island like Mauritius that has lost so much? We save individual species, but how can we rebuild whole systems? Well, an example is the work that we've done on Round Island. And there's some people here who've worked on Round Island reptiles and been on Round Island, Geraldo and Jamie. And this is what Round Island looked like when we first went there. It was denuded, and the vegetation had largely disappeared. Rabbits and goats had eaten the vegetation, and the soil had been washed into the sea, and it was a dying island. There were still rabbits and goats there. So what do? You get rid of rabbits and goats, and how do you do that? You get some New Zealanders. In my career, I've been very lucky. I've had a lot of credit for the work we've done, but actually, I stand on the shoulders of a whole range of other people who brought all the skills in. Everybody else did the work, and I get the credit. I'm happy with it. But it just shows how powerful, how really powerful it is when you have good collaborations. And for many years, we've worked closely with the New Zealanders. That's Don Merton, dear friend of mine, who restored the South Island saddleback, Kakapo, Chatham Island, black robin, and a bunch of other species. And Don used to come to Mauritius and work with us over many, many years. In fact, I'm feeling quite emotional just mentioning his name. But anyway, that's the value of your mentors in life. And I've been lucky to have had some fantastic mentors. Anyway, Don and his team got rid of the rabbits, and they got rid of the goats and then got rid of the rabbits. And within a year, we started seeing rapid regeneration of some native plants. And these are more or less in the same place, 1 year apart. But we also saw rapid invasion of weeds. And most of the exotic plants have proven difficult to control. So we got rid of the rabbits and goats, and the island was being swamped by weeds. So we decided we had to do something about it to manage the vegetation and to help restore the island. So we built a field station. It's a modest field station. Jamie stayed there for a while. And we're very proud of it, and people go and stay there for 2 or 3 weeks or a month, and we do it in rotation. And we wanted to restore the plant community. And although we'd seen lots of regeneration, many plants just weren't there. The seed bank had long since gone. And so we decided that we should take across some species that we once thought to have been there. We set up a nursery and planted seeds. We took along some young plants, which we head started, and then we planted out. And in 2001, we planted 1,500 plants. Modest, but a great start. And it was done with young Mauritians and interns from all over the world. So we did it on a shoestring, but we were hugely, hugely proud. Here we were rebuilding an island. Young Mauritians restoring their heritage. Anyway, a year later, all were dead. Every last plant we put out was dead. We'd water them when we put them out, but the island, it is so severe, so hot, so windy, that none of the plants survived. So we thought about it. And I said, well, we manage our birds when we put them out. Let's do the same with plants. Let's water them. So we built a water collection system. We set up some dams on the island, collected water, and then we water our plants. We planted out the plants, and the shearwaters dug them all up. So it just couldn't work. We were planting them out in areas where there was soil, and then the shearwaters would come along and dig them up. And I said, well, we've got to try and find a solution to this. And the botanists, bless them, said, we've got a solution. Our plants are very rare. The seabirds are very common. We kill all the seabirds. I said, no, you can't do that. We're restoring ecosystems. We need the seabirds. So we decided that we needed some intensive management. We put the plants in cages and watered them and looked after them. And we'd water daily for a week and then weekly until the wet season arrived. And our survival went up to about 2/3 survived to 1 year. And then after that, survival was very, very good. And soon, the forest started to come back. This is before rabbits and goats. When there were rabbits and goats there. And this is after we got rid of them. So it's recovering. Wonderful. Can you imagine how pleased we all felt? And all the endemic reptiles, some of these found nowhere else in the world. That's the round island boa, tellthough skink, Gunther's gecko, or nate-day gecko. They all started to flourish. Populations grow. We all felt job done. However, it wasn't quite that easy. We found that a lot of the small herbaceous plants, which are endemics, started to decline. The tussock grass started to decline, and these small little herbaceous plants just started to disappear. And this one is called Aerva congesta, and it was reduced to just one clump. And we looked at the plants, and I said, well, I think they're part of a grazing climax community. Round Island wouldn't have just been all forest, they would have been open areas. And they would have been maintained by grazers and browsers. And what were those? We looked back at the ecological history, and there were tortoises on the island, but the tortoises were extinct. And I said, oh, okay, well, we need to bring back some tortoises. And of course, everybody said, what do you mean you can bring back tortoises? They're extinct. I said, well, we'll get another species. And they said, no, you can't put exotic species on islands. They cause all the problems. I said, okay. So we looked at it a bit closer, and the more we studied the plants, the more we began to realize that there'd been these open areas. We looked back at Dutch accounts from the 15th century, and they talked about open areas with tortoises in them. And some of our rare plants lived in these open areas. And we had a path going across the island. And there was a small plant growing on it called Phyllanthus mauritiana, small little insignificant plant, but very, very, very rare. And the botanist said, you know those plants, we're going to have to move them because people are trampling on them every day. And they're only growing on the path. So they started to move them, and then they die. And I said, hang on a minute, they're trample resistant. They've actually evolved to be in these open areas with grazers and tramplers. So I said, well, we need to bring back tortoises or a grazer. And everybody said no. So for 20 years, whenever we had meetings in the ministry with my colleagues in the government, I'd say, we need to put back tortoises on Round Island. And they said, no, we can't do that. And so I said, okay then, I tell you what, if we don't put back grazers on the island, some plants are going to become extinct. And they said, what? I said, they're going to disappear. I said, what we could do, let's put back some rabbits and goats. And they said, no! And I said, well, how about a tortoise? They said, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's put tortoises. So 20 years later, the government very proudly said, we've had this brilliant idea. We want to put tortoises on Round Island. So how do you restore the function of an extinct species? We know that tortoises were grazers and tramplers, browsers, seed dispersers, and we needed an ecological replacement. And when I first started suggesting this, there was a huge amount of opposition. But we were fortunate that we could test the idea, and we were able to get a PhD student who did a pilot study on the tortoises, looking at their impacts on native vegetation. And we did a pilot on another island called Îles Aigrettes, which is very accessible and where we could study the animals quite closely. And we found that they fed on the seeds of fallen ebonies. They'd pass through their droppings, and you see the seeds here. And then we started to see young ebonies growing. And these ebonies hadn't been regenerating in decades, if not centuries. So we started to see these young trees coming back. And we did a few further studies. And we looked at the distribution, and we were finding, for the first time in living memory, we were finding young ebony trees growing away from the parent plant. Historically, we'd always found the odd one growing underneath the parent tree, but never had we seen this dispersal. And these blue dots are our young trees, and these are the parent trees, the dark dots. But also, the germination rates of the seeds that went through a tortoise were elevated. So we then had some evidence to show this relationship between this grazing tortoise and seed dispersal. And we also developed a lot of other anecdotal information to show positive impacts of the tortoises. So we took some to Round Island. We got the Special Mobile Force, the Mauritius Army, to take them across under their helicopter. And we started releasing them on the island. In fact, initially we put them in enclosures. And the results have really been quite spectacular. We now have over 600 tortoises on Round Island. Round Island is about 2 square kilometers. They are controlling exotic grasses, beginning to see the grazing climax community coming back, and we're seeing that they're spreading the seeds of screw pines and the endemic palms, and we're seeing this grazing climax community starting. These are early days. This is a project that will go on for the next century. But we see it as a wonderful first step. And we're now thinking about what other species we can bring back. We know there were 2 species of tortoises in Mauritius. There was a browsing form and a grazing form. So we brought back the Aldabra, which is a grazing form, and there is a browsing tortoise in the Galapagos. So one day, perhaps we can get some from the Galapagos. The rails have disappeared, but there's a flightless rail found on Aldabra. Perhaps we'd like to bring that back and see what impact that has. And there was a very important seabird that lived in the Western Indian Ocean that disappeared in the 1840s called the Masquerine Booby. And there's a closely related species that still exists on Christmas Island, north of Australia. So, while Mauritius has lost a huge amount of its biodiversity, we can see that we can actually bring back some ecological function. We're not trying to recreate the past because we can't do that. But we're trying to build systems that will benefit the maximum of biodiversity. And to think that when we started this work, we were just trying to save 1 or 2 critically endangered species. And over 4 decades, we've moved on. We have brought back 5 species of birds that had minimum known populations of 12 or less. We have saved 3 species of reptiles from possible or probable extinction, a species of bat from probable extinction, and restored several islands, as well as secured the future of many critically endangered plants. And Mauritius is one of the most degraded systems in the world. And it shows what we can do. So I think the one message that you must all take home is that there is great hope. We can make a difference. We can't solve all the problems, but we can make the world a better place. And we can all individually make a difference. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carl. There's time for a few questions if you want. They will bring you the microphone now.
Hello, thank you so much for that. That was, sure I echo everybody to say thank you for your diligence and this wonderful story you've shared with us. I'm a wildlife veterinarian. I help with conservation groups to include wildlife health into their conservation programs and rewilding programs. And I have seen, just wanted you to speak for a second, you were talking about supplemental feeding. I have seen some problems with communal feeding, obviously causing disease. We work only with endangered and threatened species, and we do see in these fragile populations that disease can actually wipe out populations. I'm sure you've thought about it, but I just didn't want to leave that communal feeding or supplemental feeding is important in some respects, but when not done correctly can really cause devastation. I'm sure you've thought of that. If you wouldn't mind just speaking for a second on that.
That's a wonderful point. And any management is going to have a downside, and you have to do it professionally. And when we do any of our manipulations, we always monitor very closely. And you saw when I was talking about long-term monitoring and evaluation, it's basically evaluating those techniques. So we've looked very closely at supplemental feeding. The benefits tend to outweigh the problems, but we have been working very closely with veterinarians over many years, weighing up the pros and cons. We work with Wildlife Vets International and International Zoo Vet Group. They're the 2 groups we work with. And we've worked with them for many, many years. And I have a whole series of students working with us, trying to answer these specific questions. So, you know, I've given a talk today on 40 years of work. I couldn't go into all the details, but we do need due diligence when it comes to management. You just think of managing species in captivity, you very carefully evaluate the pros and cons of all sorts of management. It's exactly the same in the wild. When it comes to managing species in the wild, it has to be done very, very carefully, and you need experienced personnel. And one of the great things that we've been able to tap into is we've been able to get zookeepers, very experienced zoo people, from places like Chester and Durrell and London and Peregrine Fund and elsewhere, people who've worked with captive animals that come and help us set up and manage some of these management scenarios, supplemental feeding and so on. So yes, what you've said is perfectly correct. And you have to be very careful. And I can see situations where, you know, you have to change things. Good point.
Questions?
Hi, thank you. I'm just curious, the 3 examples you gave us involved collecting eggs and young of birds and not adults. And I'm wondering if you have any experience in collecting adults and starting either reintroduced populations or captive breeding populations with adult birds?
We worked a lot with adults in various species. When you're doing translocations with adults, they fly back home, and especially on small islands. If you can take adults and put them on an island where they couldn't leave, that would work very well, and that's what New Zealanders have tended to do. We have harvested adults to bring into captivity for captive breeding, but it's far better to take eggs and rear the young. They settle a lot better with the species we've worked with. But yes, in some cases, yes, you would take adults. And there have been many cases where we've brought in animals from the wild because they've been sick or injured, and they've then gone into our captive breeding program. And that works, yeah. But we tend to like to use eggs and youngsters that we rear.
So beyond being a sick or injured adult, what would favor a decision to bring in adult birds? For example, you were down to only 3 or 4 of those kestrels, I think, and yet you collected eggs. You didn't bring in the remaining adults. What was the decision process there?
Like all projects like this, they have a history. And before I went to Mauritius, they had been bringing adults into captivity, and there'd been some screw-ups. It can work with adults, but conditions weren't quite sharp enough, and there'd been a number of problems. And so we decided to go the egg route because we felt that was the safest, and to leave the breeders in nature.
Thank you.
But yeah, you have to evaluate those things. Yes, sometimes you have to bring in adults. You're right. I should also point out that with the echo parakeets, the population was skewed to males. And when it came to the first releases, we released young females. You've never seen so many happy old male parakeets in your life. And they all bred, actually. They all went off with a young female, and we got some of them breeding anyway. Anyway, that was just an anecdote. I thought it was quite funny at the time.
Okay, 2 more questions?
Yes. Thank you, Carl. That was so inspirational and so good, and I just want to thank you for your commitment and the amazing work and how nicely you've delivered your talk. It's been
Thank you very much.
So good. And I'm very interested in your guy from Rodriguez, the guy that got mobilizing all the locals and then end up being a mayor or a president. What did he become?
He became a senior minister.
Minister.
Yeah.
Okay.
He's still a politician to this day. He's and a very good friend of mine, yeah.
Yeah, we need people like that go into politics, because we get stuck in this, just so technical stuff, and we really need to mobilize the community.
It was quite interesting, because when he started working for us, he was our manager, but he wouldn't take instruction from Mauritius. I'm not listening to Mauritians, I'll do it my way. So we used to pull our hair out, because he'd send in his reports, and they wouldn't be quite right, and yeah, he was a bit of a wide boy, but yeah, he's a politician. He's done a great job.
Good for him. So I was wondering, in highly populated places like Mauritius, what are the chances of gaining more and more, or getting really the locals, even the tourists? Sometimes I think about this concept of regenerative tourism, how to engage the tourists that go to places like Mauritius to restore nature and to feel good about going there. What is your thinking, your thoughts about that kind of
I tend to avoid that side of it, to be honest with you. But we do a lot of stuff. We do a lot of ecotourism type work, and we do take people to some of our islands and show them some of our work. Right. But that's not an area that I have any expertise in. Right. When it comes to people, I tend to leave other people do all that. Yes. I worry about the animals and the plants.
Good.
Well, first of all, congratulations. As Ignacio said, you are a hero for us. No. So thank you very much. You have specifically mentioned that at Rodriguez and Round Island, at the northern part of Mauritian, you have made habitat restoration. But you have also mentioned that there is only 2% of the forest in the Mauritius island. Do these species have future with only 2% of remaining forest for the future? Or do we need to make a lot of habitat restoration also at Mauritius to have future?
it's quite interesting that the work on the kestrel, pigeon and parrot drove the formation of the island's first national park. And the Prime Minister at the time, Sanaru Jagannath, I'd actually taken him up to the Black River Gorges and he'd fed one of my tame kestrels. And when they were debating in Parliament whether they should have a national park, he said, of course we should have a national park. We spent all this time looking after the birds, we need somewhere for them to live. And it's really quite interesting because in recent years, a number of people in the private sector have been restoring areas of native forest for ecotourism, and because they think it's a good thing. So yeah, there are lots of people now beginning to take degraded areas of forest and to help trying to get them back to their original form. But yes, it's an uphill struggle. Some of our birds can survive in secondary forests provided we manage them by feeding them and looking after them and so on. So yeah, we can keep them long term, there's no two ways about that. But what we're doing, what you've got to remember is we're developing techniques. We're moving forward. We're thinking about what we can achieve. And in the future, there's no reason why we won't be rebuilding whole, vibrant ecosystems. We're just at the beginning. So we shouldn't sort of give up and say, oh, this is a hopeless case. We could have easily given up on the kestrel in 1979 when everybody said, give up on it. But we didn't. And look what's happened. We've been able to achieve a great deal. And I think we're beginning to show the way forward. And this is why I like these conferences. I always leave feeling very energized when I see what's happening in New Zealand and Australia and rewilding Europe and Argentina. It's just fantastic. And it gives great hope.
Thanks.
Carl, one last question. I think your case is special compared to the other cases because I think you had kind of a double challenge in organizational terms. I mean, one is you were an NGO with lots of power and prestige in a small island, and you had to deal with the government, which that's a challenge in itself. I mean, NGOs coordinating with government. But the other one is, I mean, you are, of all these cases that we're seeing, you are the only case in which you are a foreign organization, white people from Europe, having huge power in a small island. So, and how were you able to create a productive, I mean, a long-term relationship, NGO government, and you being from Wales, leading something there in Mauritius? Because that's quite complicated. So what would be your lesson to the people, your advice?
There's no easy answer to that, okay, as you well know. But I remember when I first turned up, I was told by the people that I was working with in forestry in those days, they said, oh, we're very grateful that you're here, but we've seen it before. White scientists come to Mauritius. They'll be here for maybe a year or 2 years. They'll write their papers. They want to develop their career. Then they're going to leave. And that was the attitude. And so what we did was whenever we wrote any publications, they'd be multi-authored. We'd always do it with the people we worked with. And I've always taken a back seat. So I've always worked through my Mauritian counterparts. And because I've been there so long, they developed some respect for what I was trying to do, I think. Because, you know, I've been there working in Mauritius for 43 years now. So, yeah, they appreciate that I'm not going to run away tomorrow and pinch all their data. So I think it does require a long-term commitment.
Long-term commitment, yeah.
Durrell, as an organization, all the countries we work in, we're there long-term. And through thick and thin, whatever the problems, we'll stay there if we can. And we'll always work through locals, and we'll always train locals. And that's how it is. We're there to mentor, not to tell them what to do.
Okay. Thank you very much. That's extremely important. Thanks a lot. So now the idea is that Luis can complement all this information.
Of course, thank you for inviting me, Ignacio, and Tena Koto Katoa. Thank you for having me in your beautiful city. About a week ago, Ignacio sent me a voice message with a very peculiar task, and he asked me to prepare a brief presentation outlining my experience on reintroduction and translocation projects in Oceania and in Galapagos, but to steer clear from the typical conference style of presenting, which I've been doing for nearly as long as I have been translocating things. So it was a little bit difficult. But it got me thinking on the best way to present those kind of lessons and take a step back from the results and the typical academic kind of data reporting and reflect on what has worked and what hasn't. And I like to start by highlighting the size of the islands where I work. Some of them are smaller than the entire area of Oceanographic. So they are very small islands compared to the millions of acres of some of the projects we've listened about today. I started my career in New Zealand about 20 years ago. And this is a typical New Zealand offshore predator-free island. So lots of vegetation, surrounded by ocean. Many of them have flightless birds. And the translocation practice for those birds had developed very quickly in the last 30 or 40 years. But for many winged birds, as Carl highlighted, the problem has been that they fly away if you move them from one side to another. So during my PhD, I wanted to understand how these red crown parakeets could seed new islands and new environments, even though they fly. And there's a photo of a very young me back in 2008, and this was the first release after nearly 200 years since the local extinction of the species on a small island called Motuihi. And what is interesting is that the participants in this translocation were all members of the public as well as scientists. So it's kind of a hybrid model. You don't need to be an expert in New Zealand to take part of these kind of projects. And from that initial effort, and by the way, at the start, we were told you cannot introduce parakeets to mainland sites or to fenced sanctuaries. They just won't stay. And I'm from Mexico, so I have a funny feeling about fences and sanctuaries, borders. But our efforts actually resulted in established populations, and the birds left, but colonized neighboring islands. So the list here shows, from those initial efforts, the number of sites where other translocations led by other groups were successful, or the birds themselves established on new islands. And this document here, which anyone can download from the internet, is a collection of the recommendations for anyone to do these kind of projects. So in New Zealand, if you're a member of the public, belong to an NGO, or are a student, you can just apply for a permit to release animals on an island. It's not easy, it takes time, but you can do it. And I think that's very important to highlight. So after all those successes, we thought that we could implement a similar approach for a very closely related species. This is the Tasman parakeet, or Groom Parrot from Norfolk Island. It's a larger bird, and just to give you a sense of their size, this bird is about to crack open the seed of melocoton, of a large peach. So they are big parakeets. And we planned for a couple of years the reintroduction of this bird to an offshore island free of predators, and that attempt failed. Now, this failure wasn't the result of some mysterious disease. It wasn't the result of some lack of analysis or restoration practice. It was because the organizational approach to implementing it was following a more bureaucratic kind of outcome rather than actually saving the species. There were elements of publicity, public perception, fears of failure that actually got in the way, and in the end, that attempt failed. And some of the lessons that we learned from those experiences, from a large range of successful projects, and then not being able to implement that model somewhere else on a similar ecologically similar species, include that the fear of public opinion can actually sink a project. The efforts with the Tasman parakeet were dominated by the possibility of failure, and in the end, it was a self-fulfilling prophecy. It was not, it was avoidable, but at the time, the fear of it failing just kind of got in the way. And I can elaborate on this individually if you're interested in questions later. Another lesson is that nobody benefits from hiding mistakes or failures. So we have documented what worked and what didn't, but we have struggled finding a right outlet to present this information, because academic journals tend to favor positive or groundbreaking information rather than lessons of this nature. So academic publishing can actually hinder the sharing of this knowledge. And we need to find a way, as scientists, this is our role, as managers as well, to disseminate these lessons. Another lesson is that people have short and selective memory. If someone tells you that this project is not going to work, and you try it and it works, suddenly, just as Carl kind of hinted, people go back in what they asserted a few years before. So this is kind of a message for younger practitioners in the audience. Do not get disillusioned or lose your enthusiasm if someone tells you that something is not going to work, because they will forget as soon as you are successful. Another lesson is that indigenous knowledge and experience is central to the success of these projects. It's not a black and white kind of situation. It's not saying that we must abandon all sort of forms of non-indigenous knowledge, but understanding the indigenous perspective can help us find very powerful allies and people that are eager to become parts of these projects from their inception, rather than an afterthought. About a month ago, I spent a week with Anna Tefaiti from Nai Whenua Rahui, near Napier in New Zealand. And the stories she told me about her family links to this headland and this island here, and the ways they manage and perceive ecological systems, was so similar to many of the theoretical kind of principles that we reviewed at university. So this is the start of a very powerful alliance. So now we are talking about bringing some birds to this island using experiences that I showed before. After my PhD, I had a brief stint in the Galapagos Islands. I was actually working for Durrell, so being next to Carl feels like being among reintroduction family in a way. And in the Galapagos Islands, again, the islands where I work are very small. After the 2 years of full time, I decided that I wanted to go back every year to continue with some of the work. And over there, there are some species that are critically endangered and on the brink of disappearing. But there are many that are not, that are common, but have disappeared from certain islands. And the idea of bringing them back as ecological engineers, pretty much like the tortoises that Carl talked about, had been in the air for some time, but linking that concept to practice was kind of challenging. So the idea to reintroduce Galapagos land iguanas to Santiago Island, where Charles Darwin saw land iguanas in 1835, was a bit controversial, because it will require a large number of iguanas moved with a very minimal level of mortality. And there were a lot of worries about what would happen if we actually introduce and upset the system that for 200 years hasn't had iguanas. And in 2019, after a couple of years of planning and discussions and some basic studies, the Galapagos National Park released 2,500 iguanas in a couple of days. This is the largest movement of reptiles in the Galapagos Islands to date. And because of the pandemic, we didn't have a chance to assess their survival up to today. But we know that they have dispersed and they are breeding in the lowlands of Santiago. So at least at a very basic level, we consider it a success. And I'm hoping to check on their survival when I visit next. And an integral part of this process to bring those theoretical possibilities to reality was training park rangers. It's not that they don't know how to handle animals. They understand that, and they actually teach scientists how to do it like pros. But the link between that and creating databases and then using that to model what a population growth would look like was the next step. And for this particular effort, we had a philosophy of all hands on deck. So in this photograph, we have people that never in their life handled an iguana, as well as very experienced park rangers. Unfortunately, a couple of people ended up with shorter fingers after moving so many iguanas. But the point here is that the data keeping of this process was to the highest standards. And just as Carl mentioned, we are in the process of preparing a publication with like 50 co-authors because we want everyone who took part to feel part of this successful project. And the lessons learned in this process with iguanas is that we need to be aware of experts. I kind of try to not be called an expert. I'd rather see myself as a facilitator. What I'm trying to say here is that if you put too many experts in a room, chances are that they can argue back and forth for decades without getting out and implementing something practical. So I believe that a well-managed team of amateurs can achieve more than a group of experts when left by themselves. I also believe that the best translocation project is the one you start talking about 10 years ago, meaning that today you should start dreaming and imagining places that you want to rewild and repopulate with whatever species you want to work, because that process can take many years. So, time is, every day counts. Also, do not wait for the paper or the study that is going to address everybody's concern. It's just not going to happen. You can study a species to extinction. And it's not to say that you need to be reckless, although sometimes you can be, but again, the best way to explain this is do not let the shine or the brightness of science blind your common sense. Another kind of lesson from this experience is a metaphor. If the library is burning, do not stop to count the books. Just try to save as many books as you can before the fire spreads. Getting close to the end, we have the Floriana mockingbird, another species in Galapagos that occurs on 2 small islets. And 12 years ago, when I first arrived in Galapagos, I was told that within the month, we should be moving groups of these birds to a nearby island to prevent their disappearance. But that didn't happen because after the first field assessments, and as you can see, this bird has rings in there, we realized the population was bigger than originally thought. And Dr. Enzo Rodriguez, who just completed his PhD last week, has studied the social behavior of these birds to a point that now makes us question whether a translocation is actually necessary to save this particular bird. Obviously, this translocation hasn't happened, but that is the lesson in itself. Sometimes translocations are not the answer to save a species or to manage a species. Some systems are just better suited for that than others. And recognizing that is also an important lesson when it comes to applying for grants or creating collaborative networks. Another big lesson here is that an expert does not own an endangered species. So if someone has studied a species for 30 years or for 3 years, that's not a measure of how much they know about the species necessarily or about what can be done or cannot be done with them. This doesn't mean that you need to be, from the get-go, suspicious of everyone, but rather always stop and even think about your own perceptions about what is going to be the best course of action if you are the expert in question. And pretty much like Carl said, I believe that translocation maestros have a moral duty to mentor young biologists in this process. This doesn't mean only giving them the academic tools to complete a PhD or publish a paper, but many of you, particularly in the last 2 years, like me, have experienced the anxiety of losing track of projects because of the pandemic, of being locked up. Particularly in New Zealand, we have some of the most restrictive quarantine programs in the world. And I found that students suffer. And having the option of reaching to someone and talking about how frustrated they were and how sad they felt about their species helped them kind of overcome that kind of anxiety in a little way. So yeah, we don't need to talk about writing grants or papers. Sometimes we just need someone to vent, and that is helpful. And finally, what is next? Well, after nearly 20 years of these collective experiences and reflecting, thanks to what Ignacio suggested, I did. Here is a collection of species that I think have a huge potential for recovery through translocation in the next 10 or so years. This is the North Island kaka, which has been successfully reintroduced many times in New Zealand. But now we are, when I say we, is a large network of collaborators, and I are talking about bringing them to more suburban areas. So it is easier to bring species to places where people are not living because you avoid wildlife conflict. But that is only a limited suite of spaces, so we need to think outside the box and bring them there. The next one is the Floriana racer, a small snake collected by Charles Darwin in 1835 and restricted to 2 small islets. Turns out they are super docile. Over the last 4 or 5 years, we've managed to document their behavior to a point where we can develop a reintroduction plan. The next one is the Kakapo. Just a week ago, I was, this little chick, that photo was taken at 11:35 at night. This chick came to knock on my tent. And even though the program is already very successful, this year they produced 56 chicks, and now the challenge is to find islands to put more Kakapo into. Because the islands where they exist are now getting saturated. So even though I do not run this program, the lessons that we've learned with other species can help the Department of Conservation of New Zealand identify those islands where they can release Kakapo. Another species is the pink iguana. There is little published information about the biology of this species, but we have found that they're actually remarkably similar ecologically to the yellow iguanas. So the lessons from the reintroduction to Santiago will help us actually bring this species, pull it back from the brink because they are quite rare. And finally, these 4 Parakeet species. I work for the World Parrot Trust, and the idea of this organization in Oceania, excluding Australia, is to, if you like, snowflake that expertise from New Zealand out to neighboring islands, and also within New Zealand. So I hope that we can try a second reintroduction of Tasman parakeets in the near future, orange-fronted parakeets to other islands, as well as these 2 species of Vinny lorikeets in the Cook Islands and American Samoa. It doesn't mean that I'm the one doing all the work. It means that we are now at a point where all that expertise, all those lessons can be transferred onto people on these islands, on these locations, for them to implement these kind of projects. So thank you for giving me a space to share my experience in these projects, and I'll be delighted to take questions if there is time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was amazing, Luis. I mean, the way you synthesize everything and you fulfill the assignment, I mean, it went beyond any expectations. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ignacio.
That was great. I don't know if you have questions. I kind of like to end up on this high tone. I mean, it's been a long day for everybody. So unless you have a very important question.
You can ask me afterwards as well.
David, okay. You are brave. Yeah.
Hello. Yep. Well, thank you very much to both of you, both Carl and Luis. Very interesting talks. I just want to talk about something that you both mentioned. Is about the involvement of the local community and how the long-term monitoring of these projects is the key to survival. I very much like the New Zealand approach on how the community is getting more and more involved. I think the Department of Conservation doc is now shifting from projects based on scientists and more into the community work. But I also think that quite often we find that these local communities are sometimes not able to, to get the education. They don't have the funds or the means to go on with their education. So I think there's some interesting projects, which I was actually involved in New Zealand, in one of them, where part of the funds for the projects are going into the community to choose their own, students or people that have good skills to train them. So they invest into their training in a way that they will be the ones involved in the projects and running the projects on the long term, which means that these organizations or foundations that are working in these islands or small places, at some point they can pull out and leave the local community to take care of the projects with the knowledge that they have been accumulating throughout the years.
Yeah, thank you for your very interesting points. And I guess one good example of that kind of situation, which is becoming more and more common, has to do with the kaka. So one of the projects that we are implementing this year involves the Tainui Maori group in the Raglan region in New Zealand. There is a mountain, it's about 20,000 hectares, and there is a lot of traps keeping the predators at low levels. There is no fence, so it's a kind of Swiss cheese system of control of predators. But we've managed to, well, it was 2 years of talks and approaches trying to describe the importance of reintroducing kaka. But it wasn't until we actually stood back and gave the local community the power to decide how they wanted to implement it, that we realized the real potential of how to do it. So you definitely touch on very relevant points. And I think now that we are becoming more and more aware of the power of indigenous knowledge and local participation guided by science and expertise and all that, we can actually achieve more in that framework than the academic approach alone. So thank you.